Good evening, everyone, and welcome to this evening's Adam Smith Institute webinar. First off, thank you all very much for registering and spending an hour of your Tuesday evening with us. My name is Daniel Pryor, and I'm the head of programs at the Adam Smith Institute. And for those of you who aren't familiar with us and joining us for the first time for one of these webinars, we're a free market think tank based in London in the UK, and our goal is to try to change both policy and public opinion through research, media, events like these, as well as education programs as well. Now, this evening's webinar is focused on race and Britain, specifically in the wake of the publication of the government's Commission on Race and Ethnic Disparities report last week. And I think it's fair to say that this report prompted some strong and mixed reactions. We had much of the media coverage focusing on questions of whether the UK was institutionally racist, but commentators from all corners of the political spectrum also focused on the report's data covering discrimination and disparities in issues like education, health, employment, and criminal justice. So in this webinar, we're delighted to be joined by 4 experts in the field of racial issues to discuss the report, as well as its wider findings and some of its recommendations for change, and hopefully evaluate some of those as well. And first of those speakers, first up, we're pleased to be joined this evening by Sundar Kadwala, who is the director of British Future, which is a prominent think tank that aims to engage people's hopes and fears about integration, immigration, as well as identity and race. So Sundar, if you could maybe kick us off by running us through some of your thoughts on the report's findings, and also some of the excellent recent work done by British Future examining public attitudes about race in the UK. Over to you.
Thanks, Daniel. Thanks for the invitation to discuss the Race Commission and the broader issues of race in Britain. I'm interested in trying to have a conversation, not a shouting match, about the diversity in our society, race, and where we go now. It hasn't been a particularly great week so far for that project. We've had a very polarized debate. So I think it's worth thinking about why has the report of this commission been so polarized? What should we do about it, and what should we do going forward? If you ask me why have we had a polarized debate about race in the wake of the Race Commission report, a lot of people will say it's their fault. Not me. I was happy to have a very good debate, but it's their fault. And for some people that would be the government. We didn't trust the government. They'd already decided what they were going to say, and so they've said what they think and we don't agree. And for other people, it's the critics of the government. They will say the government has done a terribly good job. It's gone and got this evidence-based commission together, but some people on race just don't want to listen. So everybody's saying, blame my opponents. And it's also quite a sterile debate where one side is saying, you're ignoring the evidence. The government should have acknowledged things, or the commission should have acknowledged things the government doesn't like. And the other side says, no, you're ignoring evidence. We've gone and looked at all of the evidence here, and you just don't want a debate about evidence. That's really sterile and stale, and we need to get out of it. But there's a broader underlying reason about why we disagree about race that we have to take seriously. We've got very different experiences of living in this society. For example, there are 8 million people who are from ethnic minority backgrounds. There are another 40, 50 million people who aren't, and our experience differ by the ethnic group we're part of, by our social class, by where we grew up, by age and generation especially. And so we've got very different experiences. My experience of being British is informed by being mixed race, Irish Catholic, Indian background, by being middle class, by being in my mid-40s. And so I have seen from that perspective Britain open up and change for the better, because I used to watch football matches when I was 11, when there was a level of overt racism my kids will never hear. I voted in a general election when I was 18, and there were 6 ethnic minority members of parliament out of 650. So the fact there were 65 to go from 1% to 10%, that's, I've experienced those changes, but other people haven't experienced those changes in the same way. I think people who are black have experienced those changes in Britain differently from some people who are Asian. People who are Muslim felt more defined by their faith in this century than the last after 9/11 and 7/7, even if I felt less defined by my ethnicity. So there are different experiences, and young people in particular don't buy this story of change and experience. And that's what last summer's anti-racism protests were about. And I think, I was thinking about those protests, why do they have perhaps a different view of Britain to mine? And it makes a lot of sense to me, I think, if you were born in Britain in this century after 2000 and you're 20 and you're going for a job, you're not particularly interested in my stories about what it was like in the 1980s when there was overt racism. You're not particularly interested in whether your grandparents had a particularly bad time when they stepped off the windrush. You've actually got a birthright claim to equal opportunity now in your society, that if you send in an application for a job, you should be just as likely to get it, whatever your name or skin color. And that's still not quite true. And so the story of change is true, but it's not really as relevant to you as the story of the barriers you might face. The other story that's really irrelevant to you, although it's true, is that Britain is relatively good at this. Britain is relatively good at this. If we say which country has had the strongest civic movement against racism, outside the United States, I'd say it was Britain. If you say which country spends the most time doing race audits, having race commissions, collecting the data, it's definitely Britain, because it's illegal to collect this data in Belgium and France. So we've put a lot of energy in. We know about disparities in Britain. Disparities are anecdotal when it relates to COVID. And so we've done the work. But that's a message for the Elysee Palace, really. Why don't you collect any ethnic data statistics? It's a message for the OECD. It's not a very relevant message, I think, for a young graduate in Manchester to be told, well, you're a bit less likely than your classmates to get that interview, but it's lucky you're not in France or Italy, because then you'd be even less likely. That is not a relevant point, being top of a not particularly competitive sort of Europa League of anti-racism is not relevant to seeking equal opportunities. So that is why I think these two true stories, that Britain does relatively well comparatively and that Britain's doing better, is not quite meeting the needs of the next generation, which are asking, how do we speed up change? How do we close the gaps? This report, I think, tells a true story about Britain, that education is the success story. Ethnic minorities more likely to be university graduates than white British people now. Not a totally even story, but the white group in the middle, different groups doing well. It tells a story too that feeds through into the workplace a bit, but not as much as it should. That among 18 to 24-year-olds, the unemployment rates are higher among the groups with the top educational qualifications, such as Chinese and Indian groups. So there's a gap there. And so we've got the clearest evidence of systemic discrimination in our country is this blind CV evidence, the evidence that if you just change the name on a CV and send it in, it's 1.6 is the ratio. So you've got to send 60% more applications to get the same number of jobs. So that's the clear point that we could all agree on. We need to find out what's going on and we need to change that. You get to the very top of society and there isn't an institution in this country, economic, political power, cultural power. There are very few institutions that look like the country that we are becoming and that we are today. The one exception is actually the cabinet, because national politics has actually sped up on change. We have a lot of debates about racism in discrimination, opportunity and representation in politics, in sport and in the NHS. They're actually the three spheres of our society that have actually pushed on and sped up a lot. And we don't have a debate about other spheres of our society as much. This Race Commission report says about boardrooms, it says it's really flat, it's really slow, it's really disappointing, the snowy white pigs. And it attributes this to what it calls affinity bias, which is that people in the room choose people they know, people they feel comfortable with, people who look like them. So there's a challenge there. They don't particularly give us a solution to that, but there's a challenge there where we could do more. This report overall, I would say, is quite mixed in its quality. It's got some constructive proposals that nobody has talked about. I think they got the argument a bit wrong about institutional racism and so on. It's fine to tell the story that we have made progress and it's better than it was and we're comparatively working hard. That's definitely true. The story they told about institutional racism is actually really mixed up, I think. They say that they endorse the Macpherson recommendation from 20 years ago about what institutional racism is, and then they say people chuck around the phrase too much, but we didn't find it. Well, they've mixed up actually their typology. What they're saying is they didn't really find systemic racism, which is society-wide. Is there a barrier? Actually, in the report, they did find that in the case of CVs and employment, but they didn't find institutional racism because this doesn't look at institutions particularly. It has a little look at the civil service, a little look at the police, a little look at the NHS. It would take 25 reports of this length to go around assessing all of the institutions. So they've told us they haven't found institutional racism, but they haven't really given us a framework of how to look for it. So there's a great deal of confusion about these quite abstract terms, such as institutional racism, when what the report shows, which is that there's been great progress in education, it's feeding through in employment and income, but there are gaps in the workplace that look like the results of unconscious bias that can only be explained by that in the CV evidence, and that there's too slow change at the top. So what I was looking for the report was not another audit. We've had a lot of audits in this country, and we know the story. We had a really big one from Theresa May. We've got more audits than any other country. I was looking for the action plan for change. And the action plan, I think, is useful. It's incremental because the Commission is quite optimistic about where we are. It's not pushing very hard for big recommendations, but the recommendations, I think, are useful. The one about making the curriculum more diverse so it represents everybody's stories across the range of subjects, there's enormous consensus on that. And if we could have that debate rather than debate about taking down statues, we'd have moved the debate on. On this issue of disparities when you apply for jobs, it says something quite useful that I think isn't in our public debate. Unconscious bias is definitely real, and we should pay a lot of attention to it because we should get rid of it. What we don't know is that whether unconscious bias training is any good. And I think there's no evidence for it. There's no evidence against it, actually, because no one's done any proper studies. But it's very unlikely that doing a load of training and then not evaluating it is useful. So what is every institution actually going to do to scrutinise what's happening to its graduate intakes? Is it still doing this thing of offering fewer interviews to people based on their surname? They've got the same qualifications. We should be really rooting that out. So we need to study that properly. It also suggests funding the HRC better to intervene in companies that aren't doing that. That's important. The strongest bit of this report, I felt, and perhaps the least discussed, is the discussion of policing and why the police not got the trust of some minority communities, especially the Black community. And the report is constructively quite tough on the police. It says in none of our cities is the police anything like the community it serves. In none of our big cities does the police have the relationship it needs, and they need to step up. It makes some other recommendations as well, but there's quite an agenda for change there. And again, you have to say, how is that going to happen, and what will be done about it. I was less convinced by the health section because I think, again, it got mixed up between what it was looking about COVID. So there's a creative agenda here that we could work on that would make a difference. Nobody's talking about it. Its critics are not talking about the report because they think the report's got the analysis wrong. Actually, its advocates aren't talking about the report. Its advocates are talking about the response to the report. They're saying it's terrible if the commissioners are being abused. It is terrible if they're being abused. Nobody should be abused, especially with racial slurs. But actually, that's another debate about the faith and motives of different people in the debate. It's a debate sometimes now about amplifying the worst of the internet, which is a big problem in this country, rather than trying to have a constructive debate about the agenda for change. So we could have a better conversation about race. Hopefully we can start that tonight and have that tonight. We disagree about how to talk about race because there's a different centre of gravity across the generations. There's a new language about race. I'm not very convinced that we should import a lot of American language about race into this country. America is a more polarised, more segregated, more antagonistic society on race. I think we would do better without some of that, but there's a lot of disagreement about language. There's a potential consensus we found at British Future. We sit down and talk about it, we do research. There's a lot of consensus on things we could do about race to take down some of the worst hate crime on the internet, to scrutinise what's going on this bias against people's CVs, to have diversity in every major boardroom. Why are a third of NHS trusts got all white boards when 40% of their medical staff are non-white? There's an agenda for change that we could actually coalesce around, but it won't happen while we're arguing about the bad faith of our opponents on race, instead of talking about what is the agenda for change that can build on the progress from the past. Thanks.
Well, thanks very much for that, Sunda, for helping us to kick off. And before we move on to our next speaker, I'd like to remind the audience that they can send in their questions via the Q&A tab or via the chat tab as well, and we'll be addressing some of those in the latter part of the webinar. And just a follow-up question that came to me during your remarks, and it comes from Anthony Goulburn, who sent this in beforehand, and he asks, can the panel, specifically in this case you, explain the conflict of views between the authors of the report, of the Commission report, and specialists who are working in this area of policy and practice? I guess first off, do you think that there is a conflict there? Do you think that this was kind of, expressing views which don't tend to be the case amongst specialists working in this field, or actually is this a fair reflection of that?
On the whole, the argument we're having is an argument about labels and terminology and about narratives of data. There's quite a lot of broad convergence on, say, this story about education. There's been progress, but there are gaps. This story about work, which is that there are still systemic gaps. The report sort of slightly overspins. It's got an optimism bias in it, and so it's always looking to show, it's got a correct analysis that we don't know a disparity as the result of discrimination. But on some things, if you look at what it says about, say, Black mental health, it's working so hard to get a not proven verdict when you're saying, well, it's beyond the evidence doubt from what you've got. So I think the disagreement is more about the narrative, and that's stronger in the media than the content of the report. Of course, people then will pick up it's not comprehensive. It doesn't cover everything at all. It doesn't cover anti-Muslim prejudice and anti-Semitism because it says they're out of scope. I don't think that's particularly good way to think about it. It doesn't cover mixed race experience and so on. But specifically, if we got into the details of what people disagree and agree about, it's often about the narrative that is being used on the analysis from people who probably broadly agree on the glass being half full.
And just a final question before we move on, that's coming from Simon Walters in the Q&A part of the Zoom webinar. He asked, how well replicated is the CV discrimination results that you point to? Is that something that's pretty well established in your view?
There are a lot of studies, and they all show it's disappointing because the UK is pretty level with all the other countries on this, and yet on attitudes we'd be making progress. You could say, are people sort of fibbing about their attitudes? I don't think so. There's some unconscious bias going on. What I think we should be doing, so we've got really clear evidence of discrimination bias against hypothetical individuals who apply for real jobs because academics do it. Why don't we institutionalize that into a law firm process and so on, in that way, so that you get the numbers and you say, are we overcompensating? Are we still doing it? You could institutionalize that year on year and find out if we're eradicating it. But it's a systemically repeated result. And I think David Goodhart has said he doesn't know anybody serious in this debate who doesn't take that as clear evidence of a mixture of conscious and unconscious bias.
Well, thank you very much, Sundar. We'll leave it there for now and move on to our next speaker, which is Dr. Rakib Ehsan, who is an independent analyst and writer specializing in matters of social cohesion, race relations, and public security. He's also currently a columnist at Spiked and a regular contributor to The Telegraph, as well as having his writing featured in many other prominent publications. Rakib, you recently wrote for CapEx, arguing that BAME is not necessarily a useful acronym. That's something that was echoed in the Commission's report. If you could perhaps start off by explaining why you think that's the case in a bit more detail, and then share your thoughts on some of the report's other findings, that'd be great.
No, I'd be more than happy to, Daniel, and I'd really like to thank the Adam Smith Institute for inviting me for this evening's conversation. I think if we're tackling the BAME acronym, I've written on a number of occasions that it's completely outdated, it's not fit for purpose in modern day Britain. Just to give you an example, even looking at terms such as Black and Asian, how crudely homogenizing they are. When it comes to children of Indian origin in the UK, they are the least likely to live in a low-income, materially deprived household, and it is their peers of Bangladeshi and Pakistani origin who are most likely to live in a low-income, materially deprived household. But all of these groups would come under a homogenizing South Asian category. When it comes to Black, there's very clear differences in a number of areas between people of Black African origin and people of Black Caribbean origin. So Black Africans who are generally more recently arrived, so they will have a different frame of reference than many of their co-racial counterparts of Caribbean origin. They're more likely to have a positive view on UK race relations. They're more likely to have a strong degree of trust in a range of public institutions when compared to people of Caribbean origin. I think what was really interesting about the report was the fact that it tackled theories of white privilege. The reality is that the white mainstream in the UK is far from being a monocultural, ethnically homogenous, privileged bloc. If you look at the pay rates, what's really interesting is the employee, a worker, a white British worker would be paid £5 less an hour than workers of white Irish origin, which is quite interesting. And when you also look at these theories of white privilege, you see white gypsy and traveller communities which are blighted by extremely high rates of family instability, poor educational outcomes, and relatively high rates of criminal justice involvement. So I think that the report makes a very important point there about disaggregation, because if you don't have that level of disaggregation, you're not able to identify which ethnic groups are these problems especially prevalent. And if you don't do that, you won't be able to come up with the social policy solutions which are well targeted and are ultimately in the business of resolving these social problems which exist in modern day Britain. When it comes to the report in itself, I do feel that it makes a number of important points. It emphasizes the importance of family structures. The Centre for Social Justice has published a great amount of report on the importance of family dynamics when it comes to youth outcomes relating to educational attainment, mental health, cognitive development, and emotional well-being. And it also talks about community dynamics. I also feel that its focus on regional inequality, geography is also very important, considering that the UK is what it has one of the most interregionally imbalanced economies in the industrialized world. So these were important points that were made. I think in terms of the recommendations, as Sundar said, a lot of the discussion since the report landed has been, it's been unhelpful to say the least. He's talked about the torrent of racial abuse faced by the commissioners. But I also feel that people who are supportive of the report, they haven't really gone and really taken a deep dive as such, or rather through their writings, they haven't expressed why they are supportive and which elements of the report are they especially supportive of. I do think there are some good recommendations in there, along with the scrapping of the BAME acronym. I think bridging divides and really, looking to create stronger relations between police forces and the local communities they serve, that is vitally important. We do have crime survey data for England and Wales, which shows that overall people have confidence in their local police force. That cuts across a range of ethnic groups. But research I've done shows that 6 in 10 Black British people feel that their own local police force treats their racial group unfairly. So they can have confidence in the bread and butter policing, but when it comes to the overall treatment of different groups in British society, there is a slightly different picture there. I think that a new office for health disparities, I think that's very important. I think that's a good recommendation. There's been a great deal of talk on maternal mortality. I've previously mentioned that there should be a strong discussion about the quality of maternity care for Black British mothers. If you see the maternal mortality rates, Black British women are notably more affected than Asian women and white women in the UK. So I think it's very important to have that discussion. More work needs to be done on that front. I think this talk of support for families review, I think that's good, but I'd ultimately say that in the report itself, if it stresses the importance of family dynamics, it really needs to grab the bull by the horns and say how that is reflected or how that can be reflected in future social policy. Is it the case where is marriage, for example, would that be more, should that be incentivized in the tax system? Are we talking about community projects where more experienced parents that they provide strong guidance to less experienced or new parents. So I think that there is there's a great deal of improvement to be made in terms of presenting findings in a report, but then having that reflected in comprehensive policy recommendations. It's talked about, and Sunda touched on this, in terms of creating a more inclusive national curriculum. This is something I discussed on a recent Sky News podcast, where I said that when it comes to Britain's successes in terms of defeating Nazism and fascism, we really should emphasize the vitally important contributions made by service people of South Asian, African, and Caribbean origin. I feel that could really, in a sense, it would provide a more inclusive patriotism, you could say, when it comes to looking at Britain's past military successes. I think if we're looking at the report, what are the points where I felt they could have been stronger? And Sundar's touched on this a little bit. I do feel that the mixed race population in the UK, which in itself is very diverse, considering it's the fastest growing section of the UK population, I felt that there should have been more emphasis on the mixed race population. There's issues there. When previous research I've done shows that even compared to people of Black African and Black Caribbean origin, mixed race people of Black white parentage are notably more likely to say that they had an unstable family life during their childhood. There's discussions to be had there in terms of mental health and schooling. There are reports which show that mixed race children, it's almost in a sense where they are essentially forced into an identity crisis of sorts because they face bullying from both sides. So I think these kind of debates, this is something that should have been included in the report. I think, as Sundar's also talked about, the report says that anti-Muslim prejudice and anti-Semitism was beyond its remit, beyond its scope. I felt that was an error. The reality of the matter is anti-Muslim prejudice, especially in the labour market and in the private rented sector, that can have a disproportionate impact on particular ethnic groups, particularly Britain's sizable Pakistani and Bangladeshi origin communities, also communities of Middle Eastern and North African origin, and also communities of Somali heritage. So I think I think that should have been fleshed out a little bit more. At least it should have been tackled in the report. Now, one of the main claims of the report was that the UK is a model when it comes to racial equality. It's a model for white majority, multi-ethnic democracies. Now, Sundar does make the point that perhaps you could make that case that Britain is a European leader. The 2020 Migrant Integration Policy Index shows that when compared to France, Germany, the Netherlands, the UK outperforms those European nations when it comes to the provision of anti-discrimination protections on the ground of race, ethnicity, and religion. But in terms of it, is it top of the class on an international level? I would question that. I think one example springs to mind is Canada. I did a very interesting study in the past with Nikita Malik, who's now at Bright Blue as a deputy director there. Whereas the Index of National Resilience, when you take a range of national resilience indicators, such as public confidence in the democratic system of governance, public trust in law enforcement and civil society institutions, and more broadly, having a strong sense of collective national belonging. Canada outperforms Britain on a range of national resilience indicators. I think Canada, there are differences there in terms of being a multilingual federation. In terms of its immigration system, there is a liberal conservative compromise in that it has a relatively open, but ultimately restrictive immigration system. So there are differences there, but there's no reason why Canada should look to the UK and think this is a model for race relations and social cohesion and confidence in the broader democratic system of governance for when it comes to white majority multi-ethnic societies. So I do feel that there in parts the report overreaches to an extent, but I am broadly supportive of the general thrust of the report, which challenges simplistic orthodoxies, which frame a range of socioeconomic inequalities as direct byproducts of racism. So I think all in all, I would say that the report, I think the report makes a number of useful points. It does provide, I guess you could say that it provides a path towards future research. I do think that, as Sundar said, you would need to do lots of reports when it comes to looking at how citizens relate to public institutions, perceptions of those institutions being racially fair. So you'd have to look at attitudes towards the democratic system, UK Parliament, local council, police forces, the National Health Service, local healthcare services. So there would have to be a lot of research done in order to tackle those issues. But what I will say is, I think what the next step is for us as a society is to really get to grips with the content of the report, what parts are useful and what can we build upon in the interests of social cohesion and democratic stability.
Oh, thank you very much for your remarks there, Rakib, and a couple of follow-up questions from me, if I may. One of the things that popped out to me, especially there, was you mentioned the kind of inequalities when it comes to maternal mortality outcomes. Are you aware of any kind of compelling explanations for why there is a racial disparity in this area? Has there been much work that you're aware of?
Well, I've read a number of accounts and studies into this. Now, there have been cases where Black British mothers, they felt that there was a perception among healthcare staff that they had a higher pain threshold. And that in itself was interfering with the quality of care they were receiving. And that's not an isolated account by any stretch of the imagination. So I definitely feel that this is the thing. There's a difference between, for example, Daniel, having confidence in the NHS, in its services that it provides, but then thinking, is my racial group treated as fairly? And the services being given are as efficient for my own racial group when compared to another racial group. Now, people can say, oh, these are misconceptions and all the rest of it. And now you can publish reports that say this is ultimately driven by misconceptions. That doesn't mean the problem really goes away. But that doesn't mean that people just go, those perceptions are going to wash away. So I think it's really important that we have a sort of multi-agency approach, you could say. You have your local public health teams, you have representatives within the broader National Health Service, and you have maybe community groups and civic associations that come together and say, these are the problems, how can this be improved? And I do feel that Britain, I mean, I wrote a piece for The Spectator, which I said that on the whole, we are a successful multi-ethnic democracy, but we shouldn't go into a space of complacency. I think that would be a mistake, and that there are improvements which ought to be made.
And the other one from me was, again, popped up during your remarks, just coming back to the initial point about the use of the BAME acronym you're discussing. Are there many people who, in your experience, actually defend it as useful, or do you think that there's actually a fairly broad consensus that for some of the reasons you mentioned, it's not useful?
I think generally there's a broad consensus that it's a fairly useless acronym. Yeah. I think that people who tend to support that acronym, there's a degree of political motivation. Allow me to explain. So it has its roots in these ideas of political blackness. And this stems from anti-racist organization decades ago, where in a sense, in order to rally against forms of racial discrimination in the UK, they wanted to cultivate these feelings of pan-minority solidarity, and under the banner of shared Black resistance. I'd make the point, even back then, intellectuals of Asian origin were saying, hang on, perhaps this acronym here, it gives undue prominence to people of African Caribbean origin. So you could already see there were those tensions between different minority groups in terms of the label. Now, I mean, just based on some of the examples that I mentioned there, it is deeply unhelpful from an economic, social, cultural, and political perspective. And I'd also make the point that one thing I thought was good about the report, it tackled the theories of white privilege. Reality of the matter is, Daniel, some of the poorest, most deprived communities in the UK are predominantly white British. So there's that really intense forms of internal stratification in the white British mainstream, but there's a level of ethnic and cultural diversity within the white mainstream as well. So I'll just mention this case if I could do so really quickly. So there's a study in Northern Ireland which showed that when compared to their Protestant peers, Catholic peers were performing better at school. When they drilled down, that was down to sort of historical cases where Catholic communities there, they felt they were shut out of the sort of industrial occupations. So they felt that, okay, if we invest more in our education, we might move into the more sort of administrative, education-oriented roles. And then you have and one of the things they found when actually interacting with the pupils, they felt that Catholic pupils are more likely to see education as a desirable route towards the kind of employment they would like, successful employment in the future, which wasn't so much the case in Protestant, among Protestant pupils. So you can see there's very interesting dynamics there, even within Northern Ireland, between Catholic communities and Protestant communities in relation to educational outcomes. So I do think disaggregation is very important when we're tackling these kind of issues.
Well, thanks very much, and I'm sure we'll come back to you during the general Q&A, Rakib. But now move on, no problem at all. Now to move on to our next speaker, who is Calvin Robinson, a senior fellow at Policy Exchange, a consultant for the Department for Education, also a rather prolific writer, amongst other things. Calvin, I guess just to start off with you, the media reports about the Commission's work seem to suggest that, among other things, it was denying the existence of institutional racism. Obviously, Sundar's already shared some of his thoughts on that. Do you think that the media was broadly accurate in its portrayal of the report and the Commission? And more generally, do you think that institutional racism is actually a useful term when talking about some of the disparities that are addressed in the report?
Firstly, Daniel, thank you for the invitation. It's been a really interesting conversation so far. I will get to that question, but bear with me because I've been answering that question for the past week. It's the first question every single media outlet wants to ask me, unfortunately. But I will get to it. I wanted to, because like I said, I've spent the last week talking about this report, and I think it's fantastic. I've got a lot of support for it, but I wanted to spend some time looking at one area that I didn't approve of in the report. And this is the idea that we need to increase representation. I'm using inverted commas there, because there's an emphasis on the Metropolitan Police, for example, looking to have 40% ethnic minority representation in the force. And this week we've heard that the Church of England want to have 30% of their new ordinands, so people who are training to become priests, 30% of them as ethnic minority status. And I see this as problematic for a whole host of reasons. I don't think it's anything that's going to help solve racial disparities, but this idea that increasing representation fixes a problem. When you look at something like the Church of England, that already has, if you're looking for representation, it already has representation. 7.8% of priests are ethnic minority, considering that the UK has about 14% ethnic minority status people. So 7.8% of priests are already ethnic minority. The other 7% are probably Muslims. So unless the Church of England is looking to recruit Muslim priests, I don't know where they're going to get these extra numbers from, but it's all about these quotas and these ratios when we talk about representation. And the reason I wanted to bring it up today is because obviously it's been a hot topic around this very panel. As you put out the announcement, or as rather Rakib treated the announcement of this panel yesterday, it's caused a bit of heat on social media. And people are saying, you need a woman. And my question is, well why? And this is not a reflection on Arya, who is surely great, and I know you invited many women onto the panel, but assumptions were being made that by detractors that you had to have a woman on this panel. It's the very same conversation. Whether it's because, first of all, this is a conversation around race in Britain, and female is not a race, the last I checked. But also this idea that an ethnic minority woman would have different views on race than an ethnic minority man, and that we all represent different groups somehow. I represent myself. I don't speak on behalf of all black men or all mixed race men or anything like that. I represent my own lived experiences, as we call them these days. So I get that this whole representation thing is problematic for me, because would we need a woman, therefore, from every ethnic minority status? Would we need an Indian woman, a Pakistani woman, a black woman, a mixed race woman? Surely we'd have to have that to have a conversation around race properly. There's so many prejudices here to pull apart. Sundar tweeted earlier, I'm going to quote you here, Sundar, sorry, but he said, I became aware of this when told of the panel last night and raised the issue. I was told there was already an attempt to address it, and I'm glad that it's no longer an all-male panel. Well, why? For what reason, other than virtue signaling? What does it matter? We need to get back to treating people as individuals and moving away from addressing everything based on people's immutable characteristics. You know, a panel does not need 50% women. A panel doesn't need 14% ethnic minorities just because those are the average stats for this country. Does a panel also need 21% disabled people, 4% gay, 2% bi? The argument is ridiculous. And people will say, yes, but women make up 50% of the UK population. Well, yeah, 50% of the UK population are over 40. We don't have anyone on this panel over 40. Are we therefore ageist as well? And my question to these detractors, including professors and respectable people who are making this argument, my next question would be, okay, so define woman then. Because I assume a lot of these people on the hard left who are saying you have to have women on the panel, 50% this and that, would have a problem actually defining what a woman is these days. So I didn't actually see anyone ask why are there no white people on this panel either, which is interesting because we're having a conversation around race and Britain, and there's not a white person on this panel. Trevor Phillips wrote an article this week about the Mandingo effect, this idea that there are always white moderators pitting ethnic minority people against each other. I was on Newsnight last week, and I very much felt like that, actually, in that I'm on one end of the spectrum, someone else is on the other end of the spectrum, and we're fighting it off, and there's a white moderator in the middle, and it's all a bit, caricatures of each other. But why have we gotten to a point where white people are no longer part of the conversation around race in a majority white country? I find that very troubling. And this all comes down to representation. And that's what it does. It's problematic, it's dangerous, it's patronizing. I'm an educationalist myself, and we see this in schools. People say, but we need more Black people in our history books to represent. And it's like, well, history is teaching key events and figures, influential people that have helped shape our nation, whether it's UK history, British history rather, or European history or world history. It's not supposed to be representative of anything other than facts and figures. And yes, this is a predominantly white country, and people need to get over that fact first and foremost, because that's not a good thing or a bad thing, it just is. And going forward, it will obviously be different as we become more and more beige, but it's not racism to have more white people in the history books than any other ethnic minority status, because that's just the history of this country. So we're overplaying our immutable characteristics a lot at the moment, and they mean very little, or they should mean very little. They don't affect our personalities or our politics or anything, or they shouldn't. So we need to move past that. And I think what this report does, to give it credit, is it moves away from a lot of the rhetoric. It is trying to be evidence informed, which is important. It celebrates our successes. It offers solutions for the present disparities, but in a nuanced way. So credit to Sunder, because I quoted him earlier, but credit to him because we were on Times Radio the other day, and he was offering a very nuanced, nitty-gritty conversation around the reports. And then the moment I got on mainstream media, of course, the first thing they asked me is, what about institutional racism, Calvin? As I said, it's the first question everyone wants to ask me because everyone's obsessed with this word, institutional racism. It's a blanket excuse to say, well, whether they're really talking about systemic racism or institutional racism, it doesn't matter. The idea is that racism is on a large scale and it's affecting people's day-to-day lives, and it's not individual. I don't think that is the core problem in this country. This report found many, many racial disparities, but they are not irrefutable evidence of racism. There are many more socio-economic factors at play. And class is a far bigger dividing factor in the UK, but it's certainly not the only one. We've got geography, we've got wealth, we've got family structures. And as we look into things like education, which is of course my area, family structures is a key one. Parental income levels, parental carers and educational achievements. So if you come from a family where your parents appreciate education and see the importance of it, you're going to do well, or you're going to do better off than if you come from a family that doesn't appreciate education. And all these little things make a difference, and these add to the racial disparities. Your attitudes towards education within the family and within the wider community. And that goes towards what Rakib was saying earlier about, newer immigrant families, such as Black African families, tend to appreciate education better or more than families that have been integrated for a longer period. So Black Caribbean families are doing around the same as white British families and pupils rather at the moment. And that's because, Black Africans tend to support a strong family structure and also have strong, firm beliefs in social mobility. That education is the best route out of poverty. And of course, if you're a new immigrant family, you tend to be less wealthy than currently established families in the country. And we've shifted away for some reason. So it's the immigrant paradigm. right? So it's Cow and Thompson. It suggests that recent immigrants devote themselves more to education than the native population because they lack the financial capital and see education as a way out of poverty, right? This is a quote from a professor at Oxford University. But this is a conservative idea. This is something we should all be believing in. This is Thatcherite. This is Thatcherism rather. This is, the belief in social mobility. The way we improve our lives is through education, and we've lost that. White British people, Black Caribbean people, people who are firmly invested and integrated in this country have lost that belief somehow. So we need to regain that. And what this report does is it looks at, so rather than focusing on low performing pupils in education, it said, why are we always obsessing with low performing? It's important to look at it, but let's have a look at the high performing pupils. Let's have a look, why are Chinese and Indian kids doing better than other ethnic minority kids? And it comes down to this. It comes down to family structure, having two parents, stable family household, loving environment, but also a belief in social mobility, a belief that education is vital to improving your life chances. And what this report suggests is, looking into these areas where kids are doing better and higher performing and taking that best practice and modeling it across all areas and not focusing on individual ethnic minority groups, but raising those standards and raising expectations for all people across the board. And that again comes back to what I said at the beginning with let's get rid of representation and focusing on immutable characteristics, and let's raise the bar for everyone, treat everyone as individuals, everyone as British subjects, and that is how we improve society. And that's why I'm a supporter of this report, because I think that is essentially the core message it's trying to portray.
Well, thanks very much, Calvin. I'll give Sundar a chance to respond with his views on identity and the rest of the panels once we get to the general Q&A. But again, a couple of quick follow-up questions from me. The first one's on your skepticism, I guess, towards identity politics. And I wanted to probe kind of how far that goes. Do you believe in a kind of in a minimal version of it, in the sense of people from certain backgrounds are more likely on average to have certain relevant experiences when it comes to talking about those backgrounds, or do you think that it should be completely ignored when it comes to determining, say, whether someone should come on a panel, for example?
Well, I mean, it depends what you mean by backgrounds there. Do you mean like their class, or do you mean where in the country they live, or where their parents are from, or are you talking about their immutable characteristics, i.e. their ethnicity, which I assume you're talking about? If it is, then it has nothing to do with anything, really. We shouldn't be picking and choosing people based on their gender or their sexuality or their race, because these are things we don't choose about ourselves. These are things where we happen to be born with. Dr. Rakib's on here because he's a successful academic. Likewise, Sundar is running a really good company. And I happen to work for Policy Exchange. These are the reasons, and Arya with the Enterprise Network, Entrepreneurs Network. These are the reasons we're on here, I would assume. I would never like to be picked for something or invited onto something because of the color of my skin, because I can't affect that. I can't choose that. And I didn't work hard for that. I want to be invited onto panels because of the things I know or the things I've worked hard for. And I think it's very dangerous ground, this identity politics, that we need to tick certain boxes all the time. And I work for think tank myself. We're always talking about, oh, we need more women on this panel, we need this and that. I'm like, but why? What is the end game there? Because we need more diversity, but that's not more diversity. Sundar and I disagree on quite a few things. That's diversity of thought and opinion. That is the only diversity that matters on a political panel.
And the second question, someone actually asked something very similar in the chat a few minutes ago, Joe Otten. Are we in danger of ignoring a lot of racial disparity by attributing it to class, if low social class may in turn be due to racial disparity, if that makes sense? And this was one of my thoughts looking at the report, when a kind of common reaction to it is, well, you can't just explain X or Y disparity because of race. It also has things to do with class, region, etc. But those themselves, right, have got a racial component to them, if they're not.
I'm not sure I completely understand the question, but what I'll say on that is that when we look at these racial disparities that are prevalent in our society, and some of them will be down to racism, sure, but most of them aren't. Most of them, when we look down into the nitty-gritty, which this report does, we see geography, we see class, we see background, we see wealth, we see family structure. All of these things have an element to play. But then people say, but how come Black people are disproportionately affected by X, Y, or Z? And then you just look deeper into the issue, and you find out, well, that's because more ethnic minority people tend to live in cities, which is all people in cities in a working class environment are affected by X, Y, and Z. And I think the moment we shrug something off as racist, we are losing our chance to improve society, because we're not looking at the issues. We're looking at a cheap excuse And I think a lot of people use that excuse to help their agenda. We've got lots of race hustlers that are making money on our society being divided and pitting people against each other. It's not helpful, not at all.
Yeah, I think I guess we'll maybe follow up on that because a couple of other questions have come in on that sort of topic as well. But for now, thank you, Calvin, very much for your remarks, and we'll move on to our next and final speaker before we go to questions, and that is Arya Babu, who is a senior researcher and head of the Female Founders Forum at the Entrepreneurs Network, which is a fantastic think tank that does great work, and I encourage you all to check it out. Arya, I guess coming to you, what were some of the findings from this report that were of particular interest to you? We've covered some of the kind of headline findings, but I know you had some particular interest in things that maybe weren't quite as widely reported on.
Yeah, so I thought a couple of things are quite interesting. I mean, you and I share an interest in drug legalization. So I thought it was quite cool that the report called for using their evidence as a reason to maybe decriminalize cannabis and other drugs like that. There were also some interesting findings, I thought, on education. Like, I was actually quite surprised to learn how stark the difference was between how white kids do in education and how basically every ethnic minority seems to outperform them. I thought that was a really interesting part of the narrative that you don't hear about quite so often. And finally, like entrepreneurship. So I work in entrepreneurship, and generally, like immigrants found a lot more successful companies than the native populations do. So there was this great report that came out in the States a while ago that was looking at the top Silicon Valley businesses, and they found that a crazy proportion, I think it was about half, maybe more than half, were founded by people who were either first generation immigrants or the children of immigrants. So I was actually really surprised to learn that in the UK, ethnic minority people are not founding businesses that are as successful as white people. And I think that's a place where there are a lot of interesting policy stuff we can do. So I've been looking at this primarily through a female entrepreneurship angle, but a lot of the problems seem to be the same. So there's probably a lot we can do when it comes to networks. It seems that BAME people do not have as much, I know you don't like the term BAME, I'm sorry, but it seems that BAME people do not have as many like useful networks of people they know. This seems like super fixable. The government already does loads of mentoring programs when they work with SMEs, when they work with like Innovate UK and stuff. We could probably broaden those. Lots of universities do networks for SME owners. Like, this is something that's very cheap, mostly free, and something that can be done that can probably make it so that ethnic minority businesses can be as successful as white founded businesses. I won't go on because I know that we're like running close to time, and I kind of want to fight and argue maybe a bit about some of the stuff and talk more about some of the more specific stuff. So I'll let us go to the Q&A.
Well, sorry, just took a second to unmute there. Yeah, sure, no problem at all. We can actually extend the webinar by around 10-15 minutes or so if you wanted to make some other remarks, or we can go straight to the Q&A, whichever you prefer.
I would also like to say that I did like the report. I thought it was like a lot of the headline news on the first day was super incendiary, and everyone was arguing about like the terms institutional racism and what people were saying. But like when you actually read it, it seemed like they were quite even. They looked at certain places and they said, these things seem to be down to discrimination. When they look at like how people approach hiring on names and stuff, or on policing, they were like, there seems to be like a real disparity that's going on based on discrimination. And then similarly, they looked at other cases like education, like I mentioned already, where like it seemed that discrimination wasn't the case, and they were quite even and like steady, and like I think there was a lot of clarity when it came to talking about what other factors it could be. So for example, like about how children born to lone single mothers are much less likely to do as well in school. And I think when you have that information, you can do a lot with it. So you can start to, if you want to address educational disparities, you can think about ways you can do that can ease the burden on lone parents. And I think that's a really productive finding to have come out of the report. I also think it's good that it was positive. Like, for one, I know Sundar said that it might not be that helpful for a child in Manchester to hear that their life outcomes aren't as good but that it's better because they don't live in Norway or France or something. But I still think it's worth being happy that the UK is maybe one of the least racist countries in the world. I think it's nice to know that we've done that, and like to think about how far we've come over the past 30 or 40 years is really impressive. I think we can probably learn a lot from how well we've done over the past couple of decades. But also I think we should like be happy about it.
Yeah, I guess just to follow up on that point, one of the things that occurred to me is that you often have the narrative about progress being criticized as, sure, but what's the use of it? What's the value? And I guess the question from me is, what is the value in kind of acknowledging this progress narrative, even if not much work still remains to be done? Why is it that we should care about this in the first place?
I think for one, it does feel nice. It feels nice to know that we have made like the country a better place, that it's true that things can get better. Like even if there was nothing productive you could find from like investigating something, I think it is like good to make people happy. It's good, and like I think especially parents like to know that their children are growing up in slightly better places as well. I think that probably makes them feel good to know that like they've suffered in a certain way, but their children aren't going to experience quite the same thing. So I think on that basis alone, I think it is good to acknowledge and know those things. But I really do think we can learn from different cases where we've closed gaps. I think it is. Yeah, I think it's helpful to know, and I think that's probably part of the reason the report is useful. We can see places where these gaps are closed.
It's a classic utilitarian answer from a utilitarian there. It makes people happy. I love it. Well, let's move on and open this up to a more general Q&A now. And I guess it probably makes sense to go to you first, Sunda, just to perhaps respond to some of Calvin's views on identity politics and what your thoughts on that are.
Yeah, sure. I mean, I think Arya just made a great case about why telling the story about progress actually matters. I'm in favour of telling the story about progress. It does matter across the generations. I just think the British-born group have grown up with higher expectations because they're British and they're born in Britain, and so in a way that their parents came here and put up with things and got them better chances. It's an integration effect, the disaffection. So I think, but I like to tell the story about progress. I think it's a true story. Calvin goes too far. I'm quite sympathetic to it, but Calvin's argument's too French, really, for me. And I think we need a more British argument than the one Calvin is making. If you want to take a very liberal view, I do take a very liberal view of this. I'm sceptical about quotas. I'm for fair chances and no unfair barriers for individuals. And so I'm not for like checking they're the right number of people. But if you're doing that over time, and then your parliament is like 95% men and 5% women, or has got no minorities in it. And in France, you'd be like, well, we don't notice, we don't count, we can't check, the republic is still intact, it would be wrong to find out what's going on. But actually, so the outcome, if you've got fair chances, then people will make different choices. But on the whole, it will look a bit proportionate over time, give or take. And if it doesn't, you find out why is that the case. And so the fact that gender in the boardroom, for example, it's now a third of women in the boardroom. It was tiny 2 or 3 years ago, and chaps were just picking chaps that they knew, and they were a bit worried, if we have a woman, will we have to kind of change the culture around here? And they found out it's okay. They didn't just pick one woman. They managed to change the culture in a way that was good for the organisation. So in a country of meritocracy, fair chances and no unfair barriers, it will be 10%, 15% over time in the end. And if it's not, you should look at it. Probably the one area it matters, this sort of representative function, I think, might well be policing. I think where if in London or Birmingham the police looks nothing like the community it's serving, then it's got problems. I mean, we decided that really mattered in Northern Ireland and went and reconstructed an entirely discriminatory police force using quotas. I don't want to use quotas in London or Birmingham or Manchester. I just want to recruit people with the talent to be the police, and then to find out that actually if you do it well and you've got good trusted communities, you'll get a good police force. So that's the answer. It's for me. I do think white voices should be in this debate. And I think Calvin made an important point that if you have a race debate that's about the minorities, for the minorities, about the minorities, that's what for me went wrong with the multiculturalism debate. It wasn't a debate about a diverse Britain with everyone in it. It was a debate of and with the minorities. Let's not take the debate back to being a debate for the minorities. It's a debate about the future of Britain that we're going to share. So Calvin said it matters symbolically to white people to actually see and hear that they've got a voice and they're not being told, stay in a line, check your privilege. That's a good argument, Calvin, but it's actually the opposite of the argument you were making about representation 2 minutes earlier.
At the risk of sounding like a cringe Newsnight moderator, Calvin, do you want to respond to that?
No, I think Sana makes some good points, but we should always look at equal opportunities, not outcomes, if we want to encourage meritocracy. But I do want to address a comment in the chat that I've seen. Someone's saying, with respect, Calvin, you're ignoring intersectionality. Yeah, absolutely, on purpose. This whole idea of a power struggle, this critical race theory idea that, you know, white people are oppressors and black people are victims comes from grievance politics. There's this whole intersectionality pyramid where a trans black woman would be at the top and a straight white male would be at the bottom is a nonsense. And tell that to any straight white male from the working class backgrounds in any of my London schools that I worked in. They tell them about their privilege. Of course I ignore intersectionality. It's dangerous and toxic and divisive.
Rakib, I think you wanted to come in on that.
Yeah, I mean, I think I would offer a slightly different view. I think that when we're having these kind of discussions, I think the interplay between race and gender is quite important because, you know, based on the PhD research I did, controlling for a range of socio-demographic variables, ethnic minority women were significantly less likely to report being satisfied with British democracy when compared to their male counterparts. So I do think even within the debate, when we're talking about the broad ethnic minority population, I think that just sort of examining and investigating the interplay between race and gender is important. And it'd be interesting to see why that is the case, why there is that when you control for a range of factors, why those gender differences when it comes to democratic satisfaction exists in the ethnic minority population. Is it ultimately a case there's a feeling of a lack of female empowerment? Do internal cultural attitudes play a part? Is it down to ultra conservative gender norms? I think that's something that government should pay a great deal of attention to. So no, I agree. When it comes to the sort of US style intersectionality politics, I think there's a fair bit there that's unhelpful. But I think to completely say that we shouldn't, you know, examine the interplay between race and gender in this context, I wouldn't go quite as far as that.
And Arya, I see you wanted to come in on that as well.
Yeah, it was just a slightly nitpicky thing, I guess. As someone who was on Tumblr in like 2012, I feel like I've got a firm grasp on what intersectionality is. And I think Calvin's like mixing it up a bit. Like, I think the point of intersectionality isn't that you just sort of like collect as many different identities as possible and that you like layer them on top of each other and whoever's got the most points is the most oppressed. I know it sometimes from the outside looks like that's what the conversation is, but I actually think it's better and more interesting than that. And it's that like you are realistically very different based on having different subsets. So it's sort of like the same as the conversation about how BAME isn't necessarily as useful a category as possible because being different kinds of Asian makes a difference, or being an Asian woman makes a difference. The sort of you can actually collect two identities and put them together and become like more privileged insofar as that is a useful way of thinking about it. Like hypothetically, if you're like Asian but gay, that might somehow make your life better because white people like you more, maybe. Like it's not quite as bad as it seems from the outside when people are talking about intersectionality and trying to do diversity things.
You just made it sound even worse than I thought it was, to be honest. This idea of collecting identities to improve your privilege as if it's like a Pokemon game. Identity the core of our identity shouldn't be based on our immutable characteristics. That's my point. The core of my experience in this growing up in this country hasn't been the color of my skin, and it shouldn't be.
But they're not just mutable characteristics. Like you can also say that your life is, like, for example, I don't think there's any particular community that represents me very well because I think I might be the only, like maybe I think the only South Indian lower caste person born in Wales, just ever.
Let's stop looking for communities. Let's stop looking for groups to put ourselves into with these labels and these boxes, and let's just be individuals with our own experiences.
Yeah, but the point of the discussion is actually like the reason people use these words and the reason sort of intersectionality was brought up was so that I don't have to necessarily subscribe to the like British Indian narrative, because like it's an acknowledgement that my life is different and that I am an individual and that like different parts of my life are more important. Like it is to a certain degree agreeing with you on that front.
Just a comment in the chat from Ollie Hode that I find really interesting. If you take intersectionality to its logical conclusion, you end up with the individual. That's a view that I'm sure is not shared by all, but it's something that when I was writing my undergraduate dissertation, I think actually I was speaking about when it comes to, I think there's a really interesting Judith Butler quote, the kind of arch postmodernist, one of the important originators of the idea of intersectionality alongside Kimberly Crenshaw, who talks about the kind of endless etc., the list of all of these groups of identities that that you can ascribe yourself to, and ultimately you can't sum up one person just as a collection of identities, because there's too many different things that go into forming an individual. So I just from a personal perspective, I think it is possible to have a kind of a liberal version of intersectionality that avoids some of the excesses that I think, Calvin, you've rightly pointed out. But I'm sure we'll come back to that. Another question that's come up from Dennis Mulhall that I think maybe Sundar you might best be placed to answer initially is: are there differences in racist attitudes between regions in the UK? Are there some areas perhaps where progress has been better when it comes to overt or covert racist attitudes, or worse?
What's really interested me, I've been having conversations in 10 different parts of the UK, small conversations across ethnic groups. People, what do we agree on? What do we disagree on? You have a different conversation in London, and in London, to some extent in Leicester, to some extent in Glasgow, where there's a very high level of ethnic diversity. But you have a fairly similar conversation. It's also about age. You have a fairly similar conversation in most other places except the most diverse places. What really struck me was there's an enormous amount of local confidence in how people feel their local area is getting it right. Immense amounts of pride in how Preston has handled these issues, somewhat contrasting it to other mill towns. Immense amount of pride in how Glasgow has handled these issues compared to other places in Scotland, compared to England as well. And actually this comes out in our data as well. People much more confident about local interethnic relationships, the national ones, where they're saying, but what I look like on the news, it's all kicking off somewhere else, isn't it? Must be terrible in London, must be terrible in Birmingham. And so people are using their confidence about lived experience, especially if they've got contact with people, and then contrasting it to what they see on the internet, what they see on the news. And so we have this very polarized national debate that isn't actually the experience of interethnic relationships people are having. Certainly there are tougher attitudes among older people on the coast who've got less contact. There are very sort of progressive attitudes among young people, and young people might have to occasionally think about why old people are going at a different pace as well. So yes, geography matters, but age matters perhaps even more.
And obviously for those watching along at home, we have extended the timing of this webinar somewhat so we can get a more chunky, meaty Q&A in, and make sure that we address some of your questions, obviously to our speakers. If you do need to hop off, then by all means go ahead. Another question that's coming for Calvin. What role do you think that the Equality Act has played in improving or damaging race relations in the UK? Should it be changed in any way?
I think it should be abolished, to be honest with you. I think the Equality Act is a mistake. What's wrong with it is mostly interpretation. So it has this term positive action, which many people interpret as positive discrimination, which enables people to offer protected characteristics, things that people with protected characteristics, things that they wouldn't offer the majority. Therefore, it means everyone is special unless you are part of the majority. So if you are, again, a straight white male in this country, you have less opportunity in some cases than if you were a trans black female or something. Because, well, look, Channel 4 put out an advert last week. They're bringing back the Big Breakfast, which I was like, yeah, cool, I remember that from my childhood. And now they're tweeting, but we want black people to apply. And to me, that's discrimination. That's prejudice. What we want is equality across the board. And the Equalities Act, it was set up to protect certain characteristics from discrimination, but it has actually helped discriminate against the majority in favor of the minority. And that's not something that helps anyone, because if you want, like I said earlier, I don't want to be given any opportunities because of my immutable characteristics. I want to earn them. And that's not what this does. It's a shame. We need to get rid of it and try again.
Rakib?
Yeah, I just think to add on to that, so the current list of protected characteristics doesn't include social class. And I think that's something that Liz Truss actually made that point when she was saying that all too often equality debates are based on fashion as opposed to facts. So a recent report I did actually found that in the general population, people were more likely in the last 12 months were more likely to report being discriminated on the grounds of social class than their ethnic background, religious affiliation, and sexual orientation. Now, those three components are included in the current list of protected characteristics, but social class isn't. Now, the report very clearly says that socioeconomic class it's a real factor when it comes to life progression and you know, in terms of personal development. Well, I'll wait and see if a Conservative Party government puts the money where its mouth is, and actually put social class in the current list and add that to the current list of protected characteristics. But I won't hold my breath on that one, Daniel.
Do you think that that would be a kind of more preferable situation than Calvin's opinion of getting rid of the whole thing?
I think so. I think it's more about, I wouldn't say, you know, radical scrapping of legislation. I think that really needs to be discussed in further detail. I think it's more about honing the existing framework that's in place. So ultimately, as Liz Truss said, it's very clear that social class and regional inequality, you know, that these are very serious problems in the UK, and she's definitely correct on that. So ultimately, the current list of protected characteristics is not, it's not sufficient when it comes to setting effective equality policy. Also, ultimately, we have a report that talks a great deal about socioeconomic class. So surely the natural next step would be to somehow come up with a framework where social class could be added to the current string of protected characteristics.
And a question, I think, for everyone, feel free to take this, whoever wants to. Philip asks, last year, Hope Not Hate found that there are greater levels of tension between Black and minority ethnic groups than between BAME groups and the white majority. With that in mind, which Black and minority ethnic race relations does the panel think will be most challenging in the years ahead, and why? And I guess that's a more general question about, is that the case, that there's actually more tension between different Black and minority ethnic groups than between them and the white majority?
Well, I'll jump in if no one else is speaking, because I was going to point at you, Rek, because Dr. Rakib's report talks about this in great detail. I'm sure he can go into it further, but I just wanted to note that, yes, this is very true. And most of the racism that I've received over the past year, which has dramatically increased since Black Lives Matter, by the way, has been from other ethnic minority people. And I'm not just talking about Black people, I'm talking about Black, Asian, and other minority statuses have been attacking me on a racial basis. For having the wrong perspective or the wrong opinion. So yes, it's definitely a case. Over to you, Rek.
Yeah, so I mean, I think that you don't have to take my word for it. Hope Not Hate did their own report, which showed that ethnic minority people more broadly were far more likely to agree than disagree with the view that social tensions are stronger between different ethnic minorities as opposed to tensions between ethnic minorities and the white mainstream. So, and Sundar's made that point there about local inter-ethnic relations. Much of the focus, if I had to, you know, living my entire life in Luton, I would say that the social tensions here in my hometown, some of the strongest tensions don't involve white British people at all. And I don't want to go off on too much of a tangent here, but I do feel you have regional rivalries which are imported into the UK. Unfortunately, all too often, in some cases, local politics, there's a great deal talked about geopolitical disputes thousands of miles away. I think within ethnic groups, there's problems in terms of things such as caste. I know that Arya's mentioned that in this conversation already. Caste discrimination, colorism is also a problem within certain ethnic minority communities as well. This may be an inconvenience for simplistic identitarian narratives that try to frame discrimination on simple non-white versus white terms. It's far more complicated than that. And I'll say that when it comes to the more urbanized, diverse parts of the country, you will see some of those social tensions and discriminatory experiences. Quite often, they don't really involve white people at all.
Sundar, I know you wanted to come in on this as well.
Yeah, as the others have been saying, there were some really potential tensions to watch out for. Traditionally, Hindu, Sikh, and Muslim relationships, increasingly, obviously, in the last few years, Muslim and Jewish relationships, and you really want people from those communities to step up work together and depolarize that. You know, Muslim challenges to anti-Semitism and Jewish challenges to anti-Muslim prejudice working together is really, really important. People should be trying to do that. There's anti-Black prejudice in Asian communities. I was struck to the extent to which something called Black Lives Matter did actually get quite broad support across non-Black minority groups, perhaps to an extent that surprised me. But that was largely an intergenerational effect. This was an inter-ethnic group, especially of younger people. And I think we've got some advantages with education and among the British-born group that there are closer relationships and less distinct relationships between the different minority groups and between the white majority and the minorities. A positive thing that came out of our research is that there's pretty broad consensus across groups in Britain compared to America. If you ask who faces prejudice, for example, white groups and non-white groups think Muslims face the most prejudice, and there's a consensus on that. There's a bit of disagreement about the levels of anti-Black prejudice. Both non-Black minorities and the white community don't see it as strongly as Black people do, but that stands out. If you compare that to America, there's a much wider section, a large section of the Republican vote says the real racism is the other way around these days. And we haven't got that. And we should be careful not to import that. And you don't import that, I think, by having this, you know, fairness and no discrimination against all groups, and racism always round is racism. We don't want this argument that, you know, that I can be like people who are blacker than me can be prejudiced to me and I can be prejudiced to Poles and Romanians or something. That doesn't make any sense. It's slightly mad, this idea you can't be racist to people who've got more privilege than you. I mean, that's mad. We want no prejudice, no slurs by anybody. So, you know, language like coconut, it's a racial slur in law. It shouldn't be acceptable. We've got to stamp it out. But there is a broad consensus on that among the population, just not among the most vocal and angry people on Twitter.
And just to follow up on your remarks there, Rakib, a comment in chat that you're quite correct. As a parliamentary candidate in Luton North in 2019, I received more questions about Kashmir than the dual carriageway from Luton to the M1. So just someone who
no,
agrees
absolutely. And I just to quickly follow up on that point, I do think that local politics in certain areas is focused far too much on what's going on thousands of miles away, territorial disputes on the Indian subcontinent and the Middle East, than focusing on those bread and butter local issues on the dual carriageway, even things as mundane as you know, flood defences in other parts of the country. That's ultimately, those are things that impact on people's everyday lives. In communities in Luton, you know, it's a hyper diverse town, but there are shared local problems there. It could be something to do with the local transportation system. It can do with, you know, local services such as the closing of a library. Those are things that can have a real immediate impact on people, and it'd be nice to see local campaigns focus more on that as opposed to what's going on thousands of miles away.
Question also from John Chapman that I think Sundi be best place to answer initially here. Starts up, greetings from a fellow Irish Indian. Massive improvement in racial attitudes in my lifetime, but surely we need to be going after the police every time they practice oppressive policing rather than providing them with another excuse to exclude legal complaints of those who happen to be in a majority.
Sorry, could you just repeat the bit about the police there? I've missed the gist of that, sorry.
Yeah, no worries. So the question, there's been a massive improvement in racial attitudes in my lifetime, but surely we need to be going after the police and their oppressive policing. So I guess maybe your broad thoughts on the report's approach to criminal justice. I know you've spoken about it a little, but.
I mean, it has specific recommendations about the way people get criminalized, you know, around soft drugs and should they change that. But its big point is slightly at odds with what Calvin was saying. It says it would make a difference if the police were drawing from all the communities. It also says that sometimes people can face stigma from within their own community if they join the police, and that should be challenged because our institutions represent us all. I'm sure they're right about this. I think the report is kind of quite sort of on the fence about is Black mistrust of the police, which is much higher than Asian mistrust, it's much higher than Muslim mistrust as well, which would surprise people. Is that mainly a legacy of the bad old days? Brixton 1981, it was really terrible, and there's a massive consensus that, you know, policing in the Black community had a bad time, and that it's changed and Black people are skeptical but they shouldn't be, or is it still that the experience is that you are treated under suspicion when other people wouldn't? And the report basically says these things might be true, but the police just need to get out there more, engage and secure the trust. And I think this is a generational point. I think police is enormously more professional. You know, you have to take the interviews and so on, you know, the sort of all the things that they have to do on line of duty that they didn't have to do on Life on Mars, no doubt make a difference to, you know, whether or not people can, you know, abuse their power as an officer of the law. But the trust isn't there in the way that it might be. And I think that is the challenge to the police. I mean, this was the big point of, I think there were efforts, you know, big efforts in the last generation to professionalize the way the police acts towards everybody and towards minority communities. There are specific proposals here about, you know, wearing body cameras, transparency. All of that transparency has to be good. What we heard a lot of people say is, look, it really isn't like America here, but just don't say it's not like America to mean there aren't issues to sort out. If there are issues to sort out, it's in policing and criminal justice, I think.
Well, I'm conscious that I've extended the running time of this webinar beyond the initial 7 p.m. So I don't want to keep people for too long. But if anyone does have any closing thoughts, then feel free to share. Otherwise, I'll draw things to a close. Nope. Okay, no problem at all. Well, I'm afraid that is definitely all the time that we have for this evening. So thank you all very much for watching along and coming along at home. And thanks also to our excellent speakers for this evening and what was a really interesting discussion for me. And I hope for you watching along as well. And we'll hopefully see some of you next week for our next ASI webinar, Tuesday, 6 p.m. every time. But for now, thank you very much, Arya, Calvin, Rakib and Sundar for joining me. And we'll see you next time. It's a great chat, great discussion.
Thank you, Daniel. Thank you for having us.
Thanks.
Pleasure.